Yeah, welcome from the Department of Psychology as well as Dr. B.R. Ambedkar Open University. So, today we are going to discuss about the topic related to experimental psychology, and in that experimental psychology we need to discuss about the experimental method. This method deals with the foundations of psychology that is existed in first semester and first year. So, foundations of psychology. In this foundations of psychology, so this experimental psychology, one of the method among the various methodological aspects of the social psychology as well as foundations of psychology methods. Generally, why we need a method? In generally, a psychologist follow a systematic scientific procedure or scientific methods to which has done as a fantastic manner about the human behavior. Because in order to explain and interpret the phenomenon of any kind of psychological behavior. So, psychology has a various methodological aspects generally. In these various methodological aspects, so certain methods are covered, certain principles, and certain methods are covered, certain individual differences. So, here the psychology has various methodological aspects. So, ways or approaches to understand and interpret and explain the psychological phenomenon. So, in order to understand human behavior, so various scientific methods are used. So, in this the purpose of the study, any kind of study or any kind of methodology deals with the pure scientific knowledge about the subject or the content. So, here this purpose of all the methods we need to cover the general psychology as well as the principles of psychology as well as the social psychology. Of course, sometimes we need to use these kind of methods, the research methodology also. That is why we develop the scientific natures of some methods. So, what are the types of methodological aspects or methods in psychology or methods of psychology? So, basically there are so many methods are available. So, according to the methodological aspects, various types are available. So, but according to our curriculum or syllabus, we need to cover only some methods. The first method follows the introspection method. First method follows introspection method. So, introspection means the within ourself, to observe within ourself, our own feelings, our own pains, our own problems, we need to observe in this method. The main introspection method is to observe their own the problems, pain and effects of their observation. So, here some of the advantages in this method are the introspection method deals with person's kind of the capacities. It is purely individual differences. So, almost all the method covers various the types. For example, individual methodological aspects and group and methodological aspects as well as individual and group methodological aspects. This introspection comes under individual methodological aspect. So, the second method of methods of psychology, so observation method. This is very important method. The most of the times we need to use this kind of methodology for the observation of the peoples in any kind of subject or any kind of the organization, any kind of school or wherever we can use this kind of methodology. So, observation method, generally in observation method there are so many types. For example, there are mainly two types of methods are available. One is the naturalistic observation, the other one is controlled observation. In this naturalistic observation, the participants does not know about the observation of other individual like experimenter. So, without knowing the participant, they are participating and observe their kind behavior. For example, in playground or in school environment or the seminar environment, they are already participated in the group, but they do not know. So, observation method, the naturalist method is one type. Then another one is controlled observation method. This controlled observation method, so belongs to the, we need to use some kind of methods. In this, we need to some material, we need to use some interventions without knowing the participants observation. So, here the controlled observation, the experimenter needs to observe the participants behavior in controlled manner, yes, controlled situations. So, these are two methods in observation methods. Then coming to third method, survey method. So, the survey method, the previously we know the introspection method belongs to the individual category, then observation method belongs to the individual as well as group method. Because by observation method we need to cover sometimes individual behavior, then sometimes we need to use this method for the group behavior also. Coming to the survey method, the third kind of method, survey method, is the purely related to the group orientation or opinion orientation method. This is the kind of the social media effect or the political parties effect, mainly using opinions of the peoples or opinions of the group or opinions from different groups and different situations. Then coming to fourth method, case study method. So, this is also one of the scientific method. This is purely based on the individual method. So, we are already talked about the individual methods, introspection as well as the case study method. So, this case study method, the experimenter will focus on entire details about the subject or about the case or about the client. So, for example, a person having a sleep problem, from the long time. So, in this case the experimenter or counselor or examiner will focus on the previous case history about that sleep problem. What are the physical condition of that particular problem, or what are the mental illness of that problem, or what are the sociological interactions will be involved. So, many factors are involved in this case. So, these factors will be delivered through case study. So, here family history, they need to focus on the family history and personal history or peer group history and teachers opinion history, and what are the behavioral aspects of the personality about that person. So, based on that, this case study deals with the case history. So, it is nothing but scientifical manner we need to focus on the entire case history. Based on that we can analyze the, and based on that analysis we can interpret the results about that case history. Then coming to this fifth method is a very important topic. Today we are deeply understanding about this method, that is experimental method. Then finally, the sixth method is correlation method. So, today we need to focus on in detail about experimental method. So, what is experimental method? Generally, in this experimental method, the word experiment comes from a Latin word, it meaning that to try or to put to test. Generally, the experiment means to try to test or to try to test, put to the test. So, after testing only we need to understand about the subject performance or subject behavior. So, in psychology, so experimental study is used to study the cause and effect relationship regarding the nature of human behavior. For example, the effect of anxiety on behavior, this is one of the problem. So, the effect of anxiety on behavior, how we can calculate, how we can identify that effect on behavior anxiety. So, in experimental method we need to focus generally studies three kinds of relevant variables are taken into account. So, what are that three kinds of variables? These are all organismic variables, then situational variables and sequential variables. These three are involved in this experimental method. So, what is organismic method or variables? These kind of variables are related to personal characteristics of the individual or participant. So, such as age, their age or their sex, and their personality features. So, based on this organismic variables are involved. Then second variables are situational variables. So, what are the situational variables? So, based on this situational variables, so concerned with the quality of physical environment during the conduct of experiment, such as temperature at particular room or laboratory, then humidity and noise. So, that will be the situational variables. If the temperature is very high, the client or that participant will be distracted with that temperature, like that. That is why we call it is a situational variables. Then the coming to third variable, the sequential variables. So, what are the sequential variables? So, these variables are related to very procedural of conducting the experiment when the participant is required to the tested across several conditions. For example, the sequential variables, the exposure the participant to variant conditions that may result in either the attempting proficiency due to practice effects, or in developing fatigue, or sometimes monotony towards the experiment. So, a controlled experiment generally already we discussed in the observation kind of methodology, the controlled observation will be happen. So, a controlled experiment, the main scientific method of psychology uses a research method in which observations of specific behavior are made under systematically various conditions. So, based on that controlled experiment, we need to observe the systematic variate conditions. Then, so a controlled experiment permits a psychologist to test a hypothesis, because if we need to assess a person's personality or intelligence or some other characteristics, we need to frame some hypothesis. So, based on that, the testing of hypothesis is very important. So, here a controlled experiment permits a psychologist to test hypothesis about the relationship between two or more variables, and whether this relationship is one of the cause and effect. So, an investigator or experimenter will be focused or manipulates one or more stimulus variables and observes their effects on one or more behaviors, because here the behaviors need to be changed time to time and period to period and situation to situation. That is why the investigator manipulates one or more stimulus variables and observe their kind of behavior. Then that is why the only research method of this kind of experimental method that will allow researchers to determine the cause and effect of the behavior is the experimental method we can use. So, what is variable generally? In any kind of research or experiment, we need to use the variables. The variables is a characteristics of situation that can be changed, though situation to situation that can be changed. That is why we call it is a variable. So, a variable is something that can be changed, such as a characteristic or value. So, variables are generally used in psychology experiments to determine if changes to on one thing or result in changing to another one. So, that is why we need to use this kind of variables. So, what are the types of variables? So, generally there are three kind of variables available. So, independent variable, the dependent variable, as well as intervening variables. Sometimes we call it is a confounding variables. So, the mostly the independent variables. So, dependent variables, then extraneous or confounding variables are involved in experimental psychology. So, here independent variables. So, the independent variables is the variables that is controlled and manipulated by the experimenter. That is very important. This independent variable manipulated by the experimenter. So, for example, in an experiment on the impact of sleep deprivation on test performance, for example. So, sleep deprivation would be the independent variable here. So, sleep deprivation is the independent variable. So, remaining, so dependent variable, the dependent variable is the variable that is measured by the experimenter. So, here in our previous example, the sleep deprivation, the effect of sleep deprivation. Here in our previous example, the scores on the test performance. So, measures would be the dependent variable. So, it is nothing but performance of the subject or performance of the client is the dependent variable and remaining is the independent variable. Then, so extraneous and confounding variables. What are the extraneous variables? So, it is very important to note that the independent and dependent variables are not the only variables. They present in many experiments. While we conducting any kind of experiment, for example, in memory experiment, so we need to focus recall and recognition method. In this recall and recognition method, we test the subject's recall method one time and recognition method one time. For example, at that experiment, we are giving some letters, first recognition method, recall method. In that letters, they need to remember that letters by sequentially. After some time, we can use we can include some more letters for the recognition. After mixing the previous letters and present letters, the subject or experimenter will focus on the recognition method, how they will recognize previous the words or letters or things. So, here the extraneous variables, what are the extraneous variables? So, here for example, the experimenter the previous day did not know about the health condition or their sleep deprivation or their emotional balancing or their psychological factors or social factors may be influence. These are all extraneous variables. Then, so in some cases extraneous variables may also play very key role. So, this type of variables is one that may have an impact on the relationship between the independent and dependent variable. So, already we discussed earlier example the sleep deprivation and performance are dependent and independent variable. Here the extraneous variable example in our previous description, the experiment on the effects of sleep deprivation on the test performance, other factors such as age, the subject's age or their gender or their academic background or their economical background may have an impact on the result. So, these are all extraneous variables. So, what are the essential features of this experimental method? There are mainly the experimenter is one of the key point to assess the person's experimental criteria of the subject's behavior. Here the observation is very important. The essential features of the experimenter need to be observed very keen and deeply. Without proper training, the observation cannot be happened. So, observation already we discussed, there are so many types, the naturalistic and controlled observations. At that time, the experimenter focus on the observation, the subject will focus on the performance. After performance of the subject, the experimental need to be divided into two categories, the experimental group one category and the controlled group is one category. So, experimental group here already we discussed that memory experiment we need to focus on their recall or recognition, but the controlled group. So, we need to carry some other groups methods of this memory and recall. Then coming to after that we can compare the comparison between the experimental group and control group, then only we can draw the conclusions. So, here The main features of experimenter is first feature, the experimental needs to the observe second feature, based on the subject performance is the third feature. The performance of the subjects we need to carry it or we need to divide it into two categories, that is experimental group and control group. Then we can compare both groups, finally, we can conclude the draw conclusions. Then what are the steps involved in this experimental method? This is very important. So, here the first step is stating the problem. For example, stating the problem, in future a student of psychology or student of education need to study about a performance, academic performance of the mathematical level, that is one of the statement. For example, so in this we need to focus on the performance of the student on mathematics, that is one of the statement. Before going to frame any kind of statements, we need to focus on the variables and hypothesis. Then the formulation of the hypothesis. After stating the problem, we need to formulate the hypothesis. The formation of the hypothesis. Here, for example, already we know the performance of the student on mathematics. So, there are some hypotheses. For example, maybe his interest to maybe includes their performance on mathematics, one of the assumption. Second assumption, maybe his physical condition or maybe his family background may influence on mathematics, the second assumption. Like that, we need to frame 3-4 categories of hypothesis. Based on that, we can form formulation hypothesis. Then, so find out the independent and dependent variable. So, here already we know, based on the independent variable and dependent variables, the stating the problem is very important. So, according to the problem, so here the mathematical performance is the dependent variable and assess the performance, assess the experimental results may be independent variable here. So, the third step is find out the independent variable is very important. Then, so arranging the environment. So, any test we need to conduct to focus on the environment is very important. Here we need to take some samples or some population for the purpose of the study. So, in any project or any research, we need to focus on the steps of experimental method. The arranging environment is one of the best way to conduct the any kind of experiment. Then finally, analysis of results. Here we need to use some tools. For example, while we conducting any the personality test, we need to use some Eysenck personality questionnaire or some 16 PF personality questionnaire to assess their personality. So, here that kind of questions or questionnaires or tools may be used for the testing hypothesis. So, based on the hypothesis, we need to conclude and analysis of the results. Then finally, summarize and conclude. So, after analysis of the results in experimental method, we need to summarize and conclude the subject's matter, right. So, here what are the total the chart of the steps, stating the problem, then formulation of hypothesis, then identify the variables. In this within the identify the variables, there are experimental group and another one is a control group. So, both are comes under the arrangement of the environment is another step, then measures the variable with the using of testing, then finally, the analyze the results or compare the findings of the different groups, the finally, we can conclude the summarize and conclusion of the experimental methods. So, what are the advantages of experimental method? So, there are so many advantages. Generally, this experimental method, each method have their own advantages. In this experimental method, it follows scientific principles generally. So, in any kind of scientific principles, we need to use variables, hypothesis and statement of the problem. So, it follows scientific principles, that is the one of the main advantage of the experimental method. Then, so replication and repetition can be done in this experimental method. If it is if we identified wrong results, the replication and repetition can be done in this method. So, again we need to conduct that kind of experiment again. So, replication and repetition can be done in this method is also one of the advantage. Then find out the cause and effect relationship. This is very important. Without cause and effect relationship, we cannot identify the behavioral problems of the individual. So, in this experimental method, this is the one of the advantage, find out cause and effect relationship between the variables. Then, so data is reliable and verifiable, that is also one of the advantages. So, data is reliable and variable. Then, so what are the disadvantages? The all problems of psychology cannot be studied. This is one of the disadvantages. Only some of the personality characteristics or intellectual characteristics or individual differences may be carry forward, but all problems of psychology cannot be studied in experimental method. Then it is very costly method. This is also one of the disadvantage. Then time consuming method. So, it takes very long time to test the person's behavior with this experimental method. That is why this is also one of the disadvantages, time consuming. Then fails to study behavior in natural conditions. By using this experimental method, we cannot find out the behavior in natural conditions. That is also one of the drawback or disadvantage of this experimental method. Then experiments may harm the subjects sometimes. That experiment may harm the subjects feelings or problems like that. With this we can conclude about today's topic. Based on this subject today's discussion, the students or participants will be able to focus on identify the different methods of psychology. In different methods of psychology, you need to focus on this experimental method, then introspection method, observation method, then survey method, and comparative method or correlation method will be available. In this today we are discussed in detail about experimental method. So, experimental means to try or to test the performance of the individual or behavior. So, here there are some variables are involved, independent variable, dependent variable and extraneous variables. To control the extraneous variables, there are so many kinds of methods are available. So, with this kind of a total experimental method, we need to discuss, we need to carry forward about the behaviors of the problems of any independent or individual or group. Based on the criteria, we need to assess the persons, the characteristics through this experimental method. Thank you very much. Thank you, one and all.